We had some wonderful talks over the past years. You're participating in at least one of the projects with focus on how to achieve a more inclusive society, at least in Oslo. And now it's your turn to connect with you all. Yeah.
Thank you, Felberg. That was a very great speech. I'm going to steal it from you afterwards. So I did this presentation before, but I changed it a little bit. I know we called it integration, but I kind of want to say inclusion. And I want to say why. When I was looking into these definitions about diversity, inclusion, and integration, and assimilation, all these terminologies, this probably is a diagram that kind of shows why. So integration, when you see this, you're basically giving access. And now, from my work of the last 6-7 years as a journalist, every single immigrant that I spoke to felt that they were invited to the party, but never asked for a dance. So that's why I decided to use more on the inclusion, especially when it comes to learning. So you can open your doors, your schools, to immigrants, but how included are they? How do they feel when it comes to belonging? So that's kind of where I want to focus a little bit today. Now, I didn't really know who was kind of here. I was thinking about educators mostly, but I also wanted to show a little bit as sort of an exercise before I kind of launch you into my life story here, is fear. So what is one particular fear or challenge you had that you had to overcome? What did you do to overcome that? Could anyone think of one out of their heads right now?
Language? Strangers.
Talking to strangers? Yeah. How did you feel when you started talking in a foreign language?
Uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Right.
Insecure.
Mm-hmm. So what do you tell yourself to overcome that when you meet someone and speaking in a foreign language?
I thought right away that this world is way bigger than me, so it's not going to hurt anyone, so I'm just going to talk and find my way through. Yeah.
Great. So the reason why I talk about this is because through my line of work, a lot of times when I present a lot of the work I do, there's a knee-jerk reaction. Because I talk about stories of immigrants, about the challenges that they're facing, but what can be done better. But a lot of times when I do describe my work, I've often have the label that I'm a troublemaker, or I'm only very negative. And that can only come down to what I feel like it's their fear, that generally Norway is branded as a brilliant place to be in, the most peaceful, welcoming, and all sorts. But when I start saying something, one particular negativity or one slight criticism, there's a knee-jerk reaction that immediately the conversation doesn't flow. And I know a lot of you are people of color, so I'm sure you've gone through this yourself, and I have to do that on a larger scale. So that is what I kind of want you to keep going with, what a challenge, because I've been through quite a lot of them. And at some point, you will find a way. And I kind of found my grounding on how to talk to Norwegians a little bit. And one of them is learning their fear, and how do you overcome that. A lot of my work in the last couple of years has been very much trauma-informed, because I speak to a lot of people, vulnerable people, to a lot of Norwegians, you know, trying to understand why things happen, or in the cultural context of if they saw the kind of challenges and problems that I saw on a day-to-day basis. So I don't know how much you know about this. We have usually 4 reactions, especially when we're stressed. We either fight or flight or freeze, or another one, plain dead, basically. And in psychology, they call this the window of tolerance. So if you can imagine yourself that you have this kind of area, like a river. And if you expand, you're kind of overflowing, you're overwhelmed. And you can also have a very reduced amount of water coming into your river, and then you kind of feel at a point where you don't want to do anything. So you can feel those kind of reactions, the flow. And it's the same with me when it came to language learning. There are times when I'm like, I want to learn, I want to keep going, I want to keep pushing. But there was a time when I actually failed my Bergens test here, and I went, and I still haven't gotten the courage to walk back in there to take my exam again. So I'm kind of at the hyperarousal stage, kind of feeling numb and frozen, rather than the fight mode. So keeping yourself in check is quite nice. So you kind of know where you are at, and then you kind of see where you want to go as a step forward. So a little bit about me, where I'm from. So I'm from a town in Bristol, is the southwest of England, 2 hours away from London. Now, when I first came here and I say Bristol, people immediately, where's that? Is that in London? And I'm like, no. Everyone knows London, but now, you know, people are getting understanding about Bristol now. So I grew up in a Chinese takeaway, above a Chinese takeaway, as a British-born Chinese. Now, this is a very typical story for a lot of Chinese like me who are second generation, where my parents are first generation from Hong Kong. Pretty much, we live above a takeaway and see a lot of things happening. So what I saw was that our windows get broken. We have people spray painting on our doors and windows, saying basically to fuck back to China. And I saw a lot of racism growing up. It was a pretty rough area. So that is my background in this very rough area to where I'm at now. I did a degree. Now, I told you I was a journalist, right? So my degree is actually environmental geoscience. And I always am very curious about the Earth system and what's happening. But when I moved here in Norway, I wasn't able to use my degree or my knowledge in it. So I had to change my career path. And this is kind of where journalism is somewhere that I kind of went into. So when I came here, it was because of my daughter, and her father was Norwegian. So I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these terms, and I think it's only perhaps immigrants, or if it's a Norwegian who married an immigrant or have a partner, you probably learn these terms. So family reunification with a cohabitant, or family reunification with a kid. So after a year and a half of living here, me and her father split, so I was a single mom, and that was a bit of a struggle because I didn't have my family here. And still, to this day, I still need to think about my immigration status. What is Brexit? It's killing me. And also, how do I go about becoming a Norwegian citizen? Because the more I'm a person who is an advocate. I'm quite an activist of myself, and I love being part of a lot of the debates that affect my life and also others that I know. So a lot of the Norwegian language that I've learned over the years is trying to break through to that point, but still it's been difficult. I'm not going to lie. A lot of times when I have to think about is what can I do at this point of my life, at the point where I was a single mom, I need to learn Norwegian language, but I also need to find work to keep, you know, finances going and all of that. But where should I aim? What do I do? Because I remember when I did do my B1 level, and I passed it. So back then in Norway, they called it Nordplus, and I passed that. And I was like, yes, now I can go out and find work. And I sent dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of CVs every single day. Nothing. And then I kind of went, okay, what do I do now? And I remember going to NAV, and through that point they said, okay, maybe we can do some kind of praxis. I don't know if you have that in Sweden or Finland, elsewhere. So you're kind of learning the language as you go in the workplace. And that kind of helped a bit, kind of opened doors. But I also realized I need to create my own job, which is one of the reasons I got into entrepreneurship, to try and understand how I can have my own business. And seeing how my parents did it in the UK, I started to have to list all the skills. What do I have? And I know, like, you know what, my mother tongue in English and Cantonese, let's work with that. What else can I do? Now, I was actually a recent graduate, which means I didn't have much experience. So I was literally starting from scratch. And I need to figure out where I need to go. And at that point, when I want to go to media and communication, I need to do work there. And I'll show you kind of the pathway that I went in. But I thought this would be an interesting thing to show. Because I'm sure when you're learning the language, your head is kind of trying to find patterns all the time. And for me, I found that really interesting, which kept me going as a motivation to learn the languages. So I often describe these three languages that's always in my head, code switching all the time. Sometimes I mix Norwegian and English, and I mix Cantonese, and it's like my head gets muddled, and I'm sure at some point you're going to feel that way. So in English, we have computer. Now, what I find Norwegian and Cantonese very similar is the logic behind it. So in Cantonese, we have din lo. The first character actually means electricity, electric. And then the second character means brain. So basically it's an electric brain, what you have. Now in Norwegian, it says data machine. So basically it's a data machine. And I started seeing the similarity, and it also helped me to understand the cultural context of Norway and how they think about certain things. And so for me, there's a similarity in certain aspects of Norway and also Chinese culture. But the skills, for me, was how can I adapt to a changing environment in terms of labor environment and the work environment that was consistently changing. There's so many technologies coming in. A lot of the things I've learned is no longer useful, and you have to keep adapting. And that was something that I continually listened to as an entrepreneur. I went to a lot of forums, I went to a lot of panel discussion and listening to where that future is going to be. And I'm often looking at what skills I need to gain now so that I can prepare for the worst in the future, basically, but also for me to be able to cope with what's to come. So language is only one part of all the skills that anyone needs to learn. And this is just some of the lists of the 21st century skills that has been put out from the UN and other institutions that are out there. Creative thinking, a collaboration, media literacy, technology literacy, leadership skills, all these kind of things. So I kind of forge my path thinking a lot about these skills of what can I do, you know, bit by bit. But one of the things that always set me back was language. Now at Rosenhof, when I was here, I had 4 different teachers because of my own personal issues and having been in and out of the school. My first teacher was brilliant. I had no issues with her. But then the second one I had a lot of issues. It is very, very telling when you have a teacher whether she actually cares about her job or not. So one of the things that I've seen, which is quite degrading, was when I went to the class, there's a pregnant classmate that came in late, and immediately the teacher yelled at her. Now for me, I think you kind of got my character here now. I like to fight for human rights and fight for stuff now and then. So I kind of like got up, slammed on the table and said, nope, you do not treat her like this. Went down to the reception, told them about it, and obviously she didn't take it very well. And then I went to another teacher, and eventually I got to the point where I got so tired that I went to a private school instead. And a lot of the Norwegian I did was actually self-learning. I did want to bring my folder with me, but I have an injury on my shoulder here, so I try not to bring too much today. But the folder is actually all the stuff that I learned Norwegian. Now, if I want to become a journalist here, it means that I need to really master Norwegian to a particularly high level. And the only way I can do about it is actually read a newspaper and look at the categories. So you see in the newspaper they have like economics to sports and all that. So I will literally have these newspapers at home, and I will list down all the vocabulary in all of those sections. And I mount it into a folder and learn that every single day as much as I could. So I often kind of think, oh, is language really the, defining part of me? It's always been up and down for me to kind of think of this. But when I didn't pass the Baggins test, it meant that I couldn't really take a degree in journalism here. And I realized the time it's going to take me is going to be way, way too long. So I have to find other ways. Now, I am a strong believer in lifelong learning and also learning as you go along all the time. There's always something new to upskill all the time. So I knew I couldn't do a degree. What I did was I started creating my own degree. So I would compare a lot of the degrees out there on what kind of topics that they were teaching students and what kind of things I learned in the field in practice that I was lacking in. So these are just some of the things that I've learned through just online learning, like child psychology to photography, freelance journalism, data analytics, and actually there's more in the past couple of years. So this is kind of a summary of who I am, of the most of the people who know about me. I'm a journalist, a photographer, to an entrepreneur, a single mom, and a social justice advocate. But I'm pretty sure, as you all know, when it comes to identity, there's a lot more than that. I don't know if you've seen this before. This is a cultural iceberg. So what it is that this is the surface that you kind of know about someone in terms of cultural identity. So in terms of like what food you like, the language you speak, what kind of tradition that you celebrate in. But down this part is also what are your attitudes? What is your family values? There's a lot deeper. So we're all made up of many different things. So over the years, I knew that it was so hard for me to get a degree and get to the kind of work that I wanted to do. I started taking a lot of part-time work in other areas and also started building my own portfolio. So what you're seeing is the very, very beginning of my portfolio, where I was actually working for an ed tech company, an educational technology company, that was where I had my praxis work at, learning Norwegian, but also creating a lot of social media content and things like that, but also getting a feel of the idea of how's it like working in a Norwegian environment. And then I started taking photos, and I volunteered for a local newspaper, and I told myself, I'm going to write 5 articles in Norwegian, just to see how it goes. I ended up doing 7. And then I realized when I was doing it, there's certain skills that was lacking in the local newspaper, and that was the part of intercultural communication and understanding of the narrative. And because of that, I needed to go elsewhere to figure out how to be a better journalist in understanding how you actually frame the narrative of particularly immigrants. There's a story that I wrote for the local newspaper. It's taken down now, but during that time, it was about a single mother who was African. She was forced by NAV to either stop taking her studies and go to work. Can it be both? So she was taking up a student loan, and then because she was getting also this additional benefits from NAV, they wouldn't allow it. And that story blew up on me. And one of the difficulty was that I couldn't respond in Norwegian the way I wanted to kind of go through all the comments, the trolls that were feeding onto the social media. And that was the time when I decided to back off and actually was thinking whether I wanted to continue with journalism or not in a language that was difficult for me at the time, even though I was able to write, but to respond in the way that I wanted to, that was the harder part. But I decided to push on. And I kept going. I decided that I will build my own company, build my own publication, and start doing training on how to write better narratives that are culturally informed. Because that was not in any of the training that I had at the local newspaper, and neither did there were any other courses around in Norway that I can sort of dig in. In fact, I actually went over to the US for a conference there and got a scholarship, and it was the intersection between journalism and technology, and also different cultures, basically. So this is a podcast that I was doing. I've been interviewing a lot of immigrants here on their journey here as well. And I find it so fascinating just to see the different paths that people took to get to where they need to go. This is another. I was covering a lot of the Hong Kong activism movement. And it's also interesting to see how they also try to learn Norwegian as much as possible to get their story out. So you started seeing them in NRK and trying to get to the newspapers in Norwegian to express the problems that we're facing in Hong Kong. I run a podcast as well, which I also showcase not only just challenges that immigrants here are facing, but also the kind of resilience, this other side that I don't often see in Norwegian newspapers that often makes me feel pretty sad about. And I also started training a lot of the, I won't say younger generation, but I would say immigrants who are interested in telling their story or be able to cover stories. So the picture that you have down here is me training a group of refugees here on the basic skills of journalism and how can you tell that story. Because for me, a lot of the times, this is probably going a bit towards the very journalism industry side, but they often like to call themselves gatekeepers, but I like to say there should be gate openers for a reason. This is the project that Valborg mentioned. This is the Erasmus project that I had the privilege and honor to cover and get to learn so many of the educators from Germany and Sweden and here, and looking at the comparison and how they think about actually teaching immigrants. How do they get them into work? And actually seeing that comparison, it made me think a little bit more hopeful about the future. But also it got me opening to, over the years, specializing in many different areas, because I started seeing this reoccurrence, not just here in Norway, but elsewhere, and I'm sure you have the same issues in your own countries that you're in. So bank access, that's an issue. If a lot of the times people who come here, they have to wait for the D number or Norwegian number to get a bank account, but also the fact that a lot of the information is in Norwegian. So they wouldn't understand what they're signing up for. And sometimes they get shocked at the fact that they actually have charges and that they weren't told about as well. And obviously Norwegian language classes, this is a very, very frequent question a lot of people ask here. Where can I find the best language courses here to learn as fast as possible? Now, the biggest difference I see here in Norway and in the UK is that in the UK we have a lot of different courses of business English or engineering English or colloquial English. When I try to have the same format of what I've learned from the UK and try to find that here in Norway, there's a lack of that. How can you learn business Norwegian and get there? Because when I learned Norwegian here, it was very academic. So I actually already struggled when I went to work and have those small talks. Or if I had to write those emails in business, how do I write that in Norwegian in a manner that I know that I can do in English a lot better? There was not much of that. But I think now things are a little bit better. So this is interesting, because when I was setting up the Oslo Desk as a publication and continuously out of curiosity and also trying to build up my skills in journalism area, I recently won awards. Now, that was something I didn't even think about, but there was a public voting for the Blaze Inclusion Award, and the public voted for my publication, and we won the national round in Norway. So it gives me a bit of hope that somehow all the struggles that I've been through, all the Norwegian language that stopped me from going that path, but I found a new path to get there, and I feel like I got there. So I don't want the language to really stop me from pursuing my career, because I think the world is a lot larger out there, and once you have the internet, you can do quite a lot, I feel like. So one of the things that, through my line of work a lot, where a lot of people tell me how unique the Oslo Desk is how I frame the story. Now, this is a project that I did with a festival called Oslo Afro Arts Festival. We were covering the Black Lives Matter movement here, and we got to know about the organizers. We also got to know the pain points that we're feeling. And these were also not just immigrants. These were people who were born here as Black Africans. And the more conversation I was having with them, the more they needed stories around a much more positive image of who they are. So these were selections of articles that we've written that didn't want to stereotype who they were, but to really discuss with them how do they want to be seen in the media. Now, for me to do this, in a lot of traditional journalism world or the newspapers, they feel that is wrong. But for me, is that how do you know for sure that the story you're telling is the right one without talking and including the person that you're going to talk to? Because their face is going to be up there. The stories that you can tell is going to be up there. And we should be leaving a mark that they should be proud of in a way. So when I was doing these, I was having a very long conversations with them, like, what does dancing mean to you in your context? And actually, Octopizo here, he's pretty big. I didn't realize in Africa. He's huge. But for me, I was very curious of how he came to be. And he was living in the slums, and then he became a musician. He was rapping, and then became an entrepreneur. And he's now working on projects in the UN. So for me, he told me that the story that I've written about him was quite unique and different. It was a different side. So how we frame the story and the immigrant in the media and in our day-to-day life is quite important. I think on a personal level, how you tell your own story is really important. Despite the media and what the newspapers are saying about immigrants or individuals or whatever, I think the story that we tell ourselves is the one that will carry on because you're writing it. And through that, you can actually make some changes. So for me, like a lot of the times when I'm in a lot of discussion, the one thing I often ask is, how do you see me, really? Like, how are you framing this particular person or the situation? It comes in a lot of conversation I have with particular Norwegians as well. If they talk about certain areas, and I end up trying to figure out the framing of that. The only things that, the other parts of when you frame a story, particularly in my line of work, is looking at, but I don't think it gets discussed a lot, is the power dynamic. Now, in this context here, you are students or teachers, there's a power dynamic because the teacher has so much knowledge, and how do you access it? But also in real life, a lot of these musicians or these people who wants to, get ahead in their life, what kind of access do they have if someone has a bit more power than you? It's certain privileges. So for me, it's looking at those dynamics all the time in different areas. But also in my line of work, we also hold accountability. Who takes responsibility in making change? Is it us as individuals? Can we do something? And often for me, that is a back and forth for me. Like, I want to create change here in Norway. I want to lobby for change. Right now I'm working on issues like domestic abuse and discrimination. And I'm collecting as much evidence so I can lobby for change. But I don't know if I'm ever going to reach Stortinget and go in there, perhaps have to write everything in Norwegian before, say this is the stuff that I'm seeing and that these things need to be changed. But I don't know if I can do that, because maybe a lot of you think that I work as a journalist full-time when you're seeing this, but I actually work part-time as a hotel receptionist. So I just came from my night shift. So I was working from 11, so 7:15, and I came here. So I'm like a lot of immigrants here who end up working a lot of jobs just to reach their dream. And sometimes we may have to give up just because we want a more simpler life. And I'm kind of sometimes thinking about that, because this is a very long road for me, 6-7 years of doing the work that I'm doing. And the change that I'm trying to see is going to take a lot longer time. And do I have the power to do that? Do I have the strength to do that? Do I even have the money to do that? You know, that's always been on the back of my mind. Communication. Most people think communication is just words, and when you go to language classes, you have the literal translation in your head from Norwegian to your own language. But it's more than that. Every single time I have to explain what communication is to anyone, really, I say it's not verbal, it's the non-verbal cues. It's also how you do visually. So for me, my line of work as a media, I can immediately tell a company whether they have diversity or not in their company, because it's very apparent in the visual image and branding. And how you write something as well, the tone. Is it welcoming for immigrants or not? And once you learn all that, you've got all different kinds of contexts. You've got the formal way of, understanding a language. You've got the informal, colloquial ways. And now for me, like, I'm still trying to figure out the colloquial way in talking Norwegian. I still haven't quite got there. But, if you have a teenage kid or anything, probably is a good way of learning, I guess. And obviously, in Norway, there has a history as well. So they have, like, nynorsk and a history of classic. In all languages, you have, like, classic languages. So in Chinese, we have the classic Chinese that I have absolutely zero knowledge in. And also industry context. How do you talk about something in the context? For me, the journalism world, learning their lingo is not that easy unless you're actually embedded in it. And for me, it's still a step, away from me to kind of really understand how that industry work. I think I will skip this one, but this is maybe... The reason I want to talk about language discrimination is that in England we talk a lot about this, but I don't think in Norway they are a bit aware of this kind of legal context-wise of language discrimination. So in the UK, if you go to legal aid, if you're going into a job and they make fun of your accent and things like that, then that's a discrimination. Now, when I was trying to look at it in Norway, there wasn't actually a lot regarding this, but they do talk about this in the UK quite a bit. Probably something to look into and to further understand the kind of biases in the system, but I don't think in this context you really need to look into that. But I'll end with this quote, and I love this quote a lot. Because a lot of my African or Black African friends say this a lot. It takes a village to raise a child, and they tell me this a lot of times. And then when I was watching this film called Spotlight, there's a quote actually kind of flipped it a little bit and said it also takes a village. It takes a village to also abuse one. And it got me really thinking about the system in education and elsewhere, and the society that we're living in general, is that what are the conditions lies before us which makes our life a little bit more difficult than others. So I'm going to stop there. If you have any questions.
Thank you so much. She has some more time for you if you have any questions or comments, or if you want to write them down and share it with her online, it's possible too.
Yeah, absolutely. You can reach out to me. I must admit, it's this might be a bit too full on. So,
Inspiration. Yeah, it's very inspiring. Could you say something how you do you have inspiration and keep going and every steps you do? Like you said, you are a single mother, and how you manage the time taking care of your child and while going to school and work.
I think the good thing about being in Norway is that if you bring your child to work, it's no problem. In the UK, that's a no-no. But it's quite family orientated here in Norway, which allows me to do the work I do. I wouldn't say it's easy, because a lot of times, like having a child, I would, need to ask for her friends' parents to take care of her, to do the work that I'm doing. So I'm kind of actually at the moment where I'm in the crossroad of trying to figure out, this is something I want to pursue, but I was actually very close in shutting down the publication until I won the awards, and I had so many people saying, don't close it down, it's too important. So now it gives me a new reason to kind of keep going with the work, because for me, when I started it, it was out of curiosity and trying to find a space where we can talk in a way that we couldn't. And the fact that we can use English, it makes everything just so much more easier. And we wanted to make sure that there are other people like you out there as well, who are struggling the same things, and I'm hoping those stories also inspire others too. So.
It's very nice.
Sure.
Just a small comment. Thank you very much for sharing such. You shared very many details, and the most important is that you shared also the points where you felt so down. So thank you very much for that. I think it's not usual to see such honest, presentation of your life.
Yeah.
I'm a pursuit of truth.
It was very nice because I myself, I always try to keep all my problems myself, but it was very nice that.
Oh.
So I should do that. To voice out, and,
Just so you know.
Yeah. If you do something wrong, you can speak up and.
I'm not going to lie, it's been a very tough journey, and I'm sure a lot of you may go through this as well, where you have your lowest. I suffer from depression and anxiety, so it makes it sometimes a bit harder. And when I came here, the day that I found out I was pregnant, my mother passed away. So I was dealing with life and death when I came here, and I was still grieving for my mother, but at the same time I didn't have time to grieve for my mother because I was taking care of my daughter. And so over the years I've been much more trauma-informed and very aware of my mental health, and being very mindful of that, taking care of yourself first. And I think sometimes confronting that and letting it out actually helps you go through the ups and downs of being an immigrant in the country. And I have so many friends of mine who's been here and left. And some people who are still staying here are still struggling, and they're often trying to figure out, are they going to, thrive or not? And it's a constant thing that I don't think, what I'm seeing in society is that there is two lives in parallel. You've got the very privileged one and the immigrant story one. And I'm trying to bridge that gap, by telling these stories, really, that people could understand, the different layers that we have to go through on a day-to-day basis, how we have to sometimes minimize ourselves to get a job, or how we have to, take that fear challenge of speaking a different language to, at a store, And I still struggle to this day. I work in a hotel, and I can speak Norwegian to this part, but if you speak a dialect to me, I'm sorry, I'm not going to understand it. So I can try, I know like there's a pilot who actually trained himself to listen to different accents in English. So I could potentially do that with Norwegian and just have them, you know, understand a bit more. But, you know, it's a lot of effort to learn language. So.
Thank you so much. As my colleague has said, it was really great and inspiring to listen to you and your journey. And I really like the metaphor that you said about we are invited to the party, but we are not invited to the dance hall. And I usually tell, especially my kids, I said, I come from Africa, I come from Gambia. We don't wait to be invited to the dance floor. Just take the floor.
Yeah, so this is the thing, like, what I find interesting is how do you deal with those situations, right? How do you react? So it goes back to those, you know, 4 reactions we all have. You know, do we fight for it? Do we take the dance floor? Let's go. Come with me, dance with me, you know? Or do you wait? You know, everyone does something so different, and it's really up to you how you want to deal with that. And for me, it's like learning from that. I have friends as well telling me, like, just invite yourself to the table, you know? And, you know, I have thought about this, and for me, it runs down to strength. If you have that inner strength in you, go for it. I think for me, I'm taking a slight step back because it's just been so overwhelming of all the work that I've been doing for a long time, that I'm taking a break from the fight so that I can recuperate, and then when I have the strength and mindset, I'll come back out again fighting. So.
Ja, tusen takk.